Hello ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year, welcome back to the channel. This is my first video talking to the camera since Christmas, so I hope you all had a lovely Christmas or a happy holiday if you don't celebrate Christmas. Today I am getting around to recording the long-awaited tutorial for the Hulk video. But just before we start, like I showed at the end of the actual Hulk video, for the first time ever I've put all of the project files from this video on Patreon. There are all of the Blender files with all the animations and the simulations, there's nuke scripts for all the compositing, there's custom HDRIs that I took on the locations where I shot the film. So for $1 you can get all of the assets from the videos like the rigged Hulk model and the HDRIs that I took. And then in the next tier up for $4 you can get all of the project files for every single shot. Check it out if you're interested, it really helps me continue making these videos and hope you enjoy. Let's get on with the video. So I think the first thing to do before we start looking at specific shots is to quickly show the actual Hulk master file that I created before any of the shots started. I didn't make the actual model, I think it's originally from CG Trader. Where is it? Here we go, it's this one here. It's by a user called Meet Romani. I don't know if this is the original creator, but I assume so. It does say that this model is rigged, but when I downloaded the FBX it didn't have one, so I just made one myself, but it was really simple and I'm going to show how to do that now. I used the Rigify add-on to generate this rig. It's really useful. I've never used it before to this extent where you actually generate all of the custom IK shapes and everything. I have used it before for lots of my videos, but usually what I do is just go to Armature, add the human meta rig, and then I literally just put this into position and line it up with all of the joints and stuff. And then I'll do the automatic weight parenting to this armature without generating the rig itself. And then I just use that, so I'll animate it like this. For this video, what I did, which I should have done in the past for all of my videos because it's so much better, is you come down to the bone controls, you can press generate rig, and what that will do, it takes a couple of minutes to think about it so I'm not going to press it, is it will turn this basic armature into this completely customized rig with all of the custom shapes and everything. It's super intuitive to use. I never used it before, but I figured it out pretty much instantly. It's got a full IK system, so when you move the hips around, the legs and hands stay in the same place. These arrows on the legs and arms are like the pole targets, so when you rotate them, it rotates the shoulders and the knees and stuff. The thing that I found most useful is the foot has these foot controls, so as well as just moving the foot like this, you also have control over the roll of the heel. And as you can see, as I'm moving that, it stays perfectly flat on the floor. So that's all the rigging. It was pretty straightforward. I didn't have to do any custom weight painting or anything, it just worked. Another thing I did is I up-res the model and the textures a bit. The model itself is really good, but it's quite low poly. So I added a subdivision surface modifier with just one level and applied it so that everything was a bit smoother. And then I also up-res the textures. To do that, I brought them into Nuke, and I used a node called the TVI scale in Nuke. There is now an AI upscale, which will probably do a slightly better job. The TVI scale is basically the old-fashioned way of doing this. So the textures came in as 1K, which is alright, but not super high resolution. What the TVI scale node does is it doubles the resolution of anything you plug into it. So I stacked two of these on top of each other and generated a 4K version of the image textures. This is what it looks like now, and if I flick between the before and after, you can see it's not exactly adding detail because that's not how this works, but it's just getting rid of the pixelated edges on all of the fine lines. So in some of the shots where the model is quite close to the camera, these textures should hold up a little bit better. And then as well as that, to add some extra detail, I added 3 hair particle systems onto the model. I did one for the arms, one for the chest hair, and one for the beard, because I wanted it to make it look like my beard in real life. And if I go into rendered view, you can see what these look like. The hair really helps to add some extra detail, especially on the arms, and you can see it in some of the close-ups. As well as adding some detail onto the surface, it also changes the silhouette because you can kind of see the hair catching the light on the edge. This is the shader that I built for the skin. Again, the textures that came with it were pretty good, but they needed a lot of work to get it to look a bit more photorealistic. So if I zoom into the skin and get quite close, you can see that this still really holds up quite well. To fake the look of the pores, I used a Voronoi texture, or Voronoi, however you say it. And I'm using this going into a bump map, as well as some of the other normal maps and stuff that came with it for the veins. And I'm using that same texture also going into the roughness and multiplying that over the top of the roughness map that came with the model too. So those two things combined give this really nice high frequency detail to the skin. I also added some subsurface scattering into the principled shader, so I put a lamp here, you'll be able to see it working. The red glow that you can see coming through the ear here is the subsurface scattering, where the light is penetrating the mesh and illuminating it from the inside. That really helps as well in some of the close-up shots to make it feel more realistic. So this is like the master Blender file that I used, and then I linked this into all of the shots, so this was the fully made asset that was ready to go to be animated. So let's talk about some shots. All of the shots up until you see the CG arm are done pretty much all in 2D, so it's just compositing magic. So let's jump on this one first, shot 7. This is the blend file. As you can see, I've just cut off the arms. I didn't need the rest of the body, and it just made it a little bit lighter to compute and render. If I go into the camera view, go into wireframe, you can see I've got the footage set up as the background. And then all I did is use the rig that I made to animate the Hulk on top. I didn't do any object tracking or anything for this, it's just animated by hand. It's a fairly straightforward shot. The IK system made it really easy to add the kind of high frequency wobbling of the arm, so it didn't feel like it was too static. And what I mean by that is that I can take the torso and move it like this, and because the hand is an IK, it stays in place. So over the course of the shot, I animated the torso to move around a bit, which makes the forearm wobble around a bit as well, makes it feel a bit more connected to my body. In terms of rendering, it was really straightforward. There's just 2 passes out of this. I rendered the Hulk arm, obviously, which looks like this. And then I also rendered a shadow pass, which is just for putting on the floor so that there's some shadow interaction. So let's have a look at the comp. There's nothing super complicated going on. As you can see, it's a fairly small script. Starting off at the top, we have the footage. Then we made sure to film a clean plate, so I had some floor without anything on it. I had to extend it slightly, so I just did a little bit of rotor paint to clone a bit of the tiles over here, so I had some more room around the edge of the frame. And then this gets tracked into place into the shot. So that's removing my arm and the top bit of my torso and shoulders. Then I've got a couple of grade nodes here that are adding some green skin onto my neck and face. This was all just done completely in 2D using some rotor shapes. I just rotoed my head, which looks like this. And then I used a second mask that has a fractal blur on it, which kind of distorts it using a noise texture. And I used this to creep across my face and reveal the green over the course of the shot. So it looks like this. So this shape is used as a mask on the original shape, which is the rotor of my head. So as you can see, the texture just grows across it. Then I used that alpha to grade my skin, so by the end of the shot you can see that my head and my neck are pretty much completely green. That's before and after. Then I have the CG shadow pass from Blender. This is what the alpha looks like. And then I'm using a color correct node here to take a little bit of the contrast out of the floor. I like to do this in 2 phases instead of just making it darker, because removing the contrast takes out a lot of the specular highlights. So it's kind of a cheap 2D way of removing all of the reflections from the floor. And then I have a grade node that's actually doing the majority of the shadow effect and making it darker. Next up we have the CG Hulk arm. This is what it looks like fully comped, but if I turn off all of the color corrections and stuff, it looks like this originally. I found this shot quite difficult to match the lighting and everything, so I did lots of iterations, which I'll show in a second. First of all, I shuffled out the glossy direct pass, and I just removed some of the speck from the fingernails up here because they were really hot in the render. So I'm just using a grade node to knock them back quite a bit. Then there's just some general color correction and exposure tweaks, removing a little bit of contrast so it matched the footage better. And I also added a shadow here just using a rotor shape, so it felt like there was a shadow from my body on the CG arm, which obviously there would be in real life. Then I put my torso back on top. I did this just by keying the blue of my shirt because it's quite a punchy blue color, so it worked out quite well. This is the key, and then I just inverted it so I have just my torso. And then I did a bit of a warp effect on this, which I don't know if people will have noticed or not because it's quite subtle, but I'm using a spline warp, and if I show it basically around here, my torso starts to get a bit bigger and it feels like it's expanding. So you can sort of see it there, my shoulder suddenly gets quite a bit bigger. The way I did this is, like I said, using a spline warp node in Nuke. This is pretty much the same as the puppet warp tool in After Effects. So you can use the pins here to put them into your footage, and then you can drag these points around to warp your image essentially. So I have a few keyframes throughout the shot that are just making my shoulders and my arm a bit bigger. And when you combine all of those things, you get this effect. Like I mentioned before, I did loads of iterations of this. So this is my version 6 of the comp. If I show you my V1, you'll probably be quite shocked at how far it came on. This was the first version. And this is using the model of the Hulk before I did any of the stuff to improve it. So this is unsubdivided, this is with the low res textures, and it also doesn't have the hair system on the arms, which I think really helps sell it in. So this is again before and after. There's an enormous change there. You can see how much difference adding the Voronoi texture for the skin made as well. You get all of these really nice specular highlights all over it. So that's shot 7, and then in the following shot we go into full-blown CG Hulk, which is this one. So this is shot 8, as you can see. The obvious things happening here are there's a rigid body simulation of the door smashing, and in the final render there's lots of compositing with the shadow pass and stuff to make this look nice. I'm not a very good animator, so I struggled a bit at the beginning when I was trying to animate this shot. It's quite a complicated animation to have the character stumbling out and then bouncing off the wall. So what I ended up doing, and what lots of professional animators do all the time, is I shot some reference. So if I go into my footage folder down here, I filmed this, which is basically me acting out the animation that I wanted. It's not perfect, and obviously the Hulk is a lot bigger and heavier than me. I tried to act a little bit heavier than I actually am. But it's a very good basis to see sort of where your feet land and how much your arms react with the wall when you're pushing off of it. So I brought this into Blender and just kind of went through to the key poses and blocked out the timings of the positions, and it really helped me to get the animation looking a lot more realistic. So if anyone is trying to do the same thing, I highly recommend shooting some animation reference. The background footage is live action, so this is actually filmed in the corridor in my flats. I 3D tracked the shot, and then I just built some very basic geometry for the corridor. It's really easy to do this once you have the 3D track working, because you can just add an object into your scene, and then you can just expand the model from here. So you can say, okay, the ceiling is this high, and it goes back this far into the corridor. There's a loop cut here and here, and then the door goes in here, and very quickly you can build a model of the corridor. The model is serving two purposes. It's a collision mesh for the rigid body simulation of the door, and it's also the shadow catcher for rendering the shadow pass. When I made the door, I took a few photos of the door at the front of my flat and then projected those textures onto the front and side of it to give this nice detail. So we've got this one. I painted off the door handle and the number, mostly so I didn't have to make models of them as well. And then this is a photo of me holding the door open with my foot. I have a fire safety thing that closes the door automatically, so I was really struggling to get a photo of the side of the door. But I used this bit to project onto the side so that I had all of the angles covered. And then what I did, once that was textured, is I ran it through the rigid body simulation. So just very quickly, how to do that, if you don't know, is I made something that's roughly the shape of a door, like this. I put it here, but let's just do it off the side so we can actually see. Then what you want to do is subdivide it a few times so that the cell fracture add-on has some geo to work with. And then what I did is I used the grease pencil to draw a custom crack onto the door. So you can do that just by holding D and clicking and dragging with your mouse. And I made this kind of crack just like this. Doesn't have to be super accurate. So all of these lines should in some way inform the cell fracture of how to work. So I add the cell fracture add-on. You can set the point source to annotation pencil, which means the grease pencil lines that we've drawn here. I set the source limit quite low because I just wanted a few big chunks, so let's go for something like 16. I put a little bit of noise into it just to add some randomness. I set the recursive shatter to random as well, so we get some different size pieces. And then if we press OK, you can see it shatters the door. I must have done a few more pieces because this one doesn't look particularly shattered, but that's fine. And then from here, what you can do is select all of them, come up to Object, Rigid Body, Add Active. And then in the rigid body settings, come down to the bottom, and I turned on deactivation and start deactivated, which means they won't start simulating until something hits them. And then over here, the thing that hits them is this cylinder that I just animated to smack into them. This is also a rigid body. I set this one to passive and turned on animated so it knows that it's not meant to be simulating, it's just something to affect the rigid body simulation. And then I just animated this like a battering ram to knock into the door, and as you can see, it sends all of the pieces flying. I also did a secondary simulation that's just a load of particles coming out of this emitter, and I just wanted these to kind of simulate some splinters and sawdust and stuff coming out the door, and then they all just land on the floor and settle. To make the model look a bit more interesting, I kind of made these like fractured bits of wood texture. So I modeled some extra bits of geo just sticking out the side of the big chunks of the door. And these have got a different wood texture on them, so they're like the inside of the door. And then I parented them to the big chunks so they move with them, like this. And that just helps to make it look like the door was kind of snapped in half. In terms of rendering for this shot, I rendered 3 passes. We have the Hulk on its own again, like the last one. This is the compositor off to the side. Then I rendered a shadow pass, which is just using the scene geometry set to a shadow catcher for all of the interaction with the walls and the floor. And this also has the shadows from the debris in it. And then thirdly, I have a debris pass, which is just the splinters and the bits of the door. To get the lighting to look good, I projected a frame of the background footage onto the set geo so that it kind of has the general tones of the environment, and that bounce light will bounce back onto the Hulk and influence the lighting. And then I can see where all the lights are in the ceiling, so I added some area lights up there just to get the lighting to look correct and from the right direction. For the compositing of this shot, again, it was pretty straightforward. I started off with the footage. Then I did some tracking marker removal, so I just used some transform masks to get rid of all of the tracking markers. Then I put some cracks on the wall where the Hulk comes out and smacks into it, so it adds some damage. To do this, I just brought the camera in from Blender, so I have the 3D camera, and I also have the geometry for the set, which looks like this. And then I just projected those textures onto the geometry and rendered that out in 3D, which gives me these nicely tracked into the shot. Then we have the shadow pass. Again, I'm doing the little contrast trick by using a color correct node to take some contrast out and then dropping the gain to make it darker. I also put a little bit more warmth and red into the shadows just to match the tones of the room. Then we have the debris layer. These didn't really need any comp work, I just made them a bit warmer, I think, and changed the brightness ever so slightly. So this is all the color correction tweaks and stuff I did to them. A little bit of defocus as they're slightly out of focus on the floor. And then the Hulk goes on top. Again, not loads of comp work. This is what it's like just out of Blender, and then this is with all the color corrections. I shuffled out the glossy direct pass and just made it a tiny bit brighter so that those highlights ping a bit more on the skin. Then there's a slight exposure lift just to get it to match the shot a bit better. A good trick I learned from the lead at work a few years ago for getting colors of CG to match live action a bit better is you can take the background footage, blur it by about 400 pixels or whatever it is, 200 in this case, and then screen this over the top of the CG just really subtly. So I've set the value in the mix node to be 0.03, so it's just a 3% mix. But if I turn it on and off, you can see it's just introducing some of the cream tones from the wall into the shadows and stuff on the Hulk. It feels a little bit like adding fake bounce light. I also have a hue correct on here, which is taking a little bit of the saturation out of the greens and yellows in his skin. I found that out of Blender they were a little bit nuclear, so I look at it over the footage without this. It's quite a subtle change, but you can see here he's very saturated. So what the hue correct allows you to do is take out saturation just for certain colours. So here I've taken some points on the green and yellow and just lowered them slightly, and that's just reducing a little bit of the saturation from his skin tones, which I think looks a lot more photorealistic. Then again, a little bit of defocus, and there's a tiny bit of light wrap on here as well, because there's a couple of points where he crosses over some of the lights on the ceiling, like here. So the light wrap is just introducing that back into the silhouette, which works quite well. And that is how that shot was done. This is one of my favourites. I think the door exploding looks really cool. It was quite a good effect. It worked quite successfully. After that, all the shots are pretty much the same. So it's just 3D tracking the Hulk into the shots and getting the lighting to match and comping it nicely. This shot here is actually fully CG. I'll just talk about this very quickly. As you can see, I did actually film a plate for this, and I was intending to use this and then just do a 3D hand and track it into the shot. But after looking at it, I thought it would actually just be easier to do this fully in CG. Then I could have more control over the camera animation, and all the lighting would feel a bit more cohesive if the entire scene was just lit in 3D instead of trying to match CG with live action. As you can see here, this is the actual 3D scene. What I ended up doing is I took the footage that we filmed and I made a couple of clean plates. So I did one without the buttons and I made one without the entire thing on the wall. And then I projected these textures. So if I go into render view, this wall is projected, and I also projected the background over here, which is the lift behind. And then I made a rough 3D model of this button on the wall and then projected the textures onto that as well. So it's kind of a mix between 2D and 3D, because it's using the textures from the footage as the initial kind of base layer. But then I also turned up the metallic and lowered the roughness slightly in the shader, which means it still has 3D shading on it. And the benefit of this is that when the finger comes in to press the button, you can actually see the reflection of it here, which looks really good. Like I said, doing it fully in 3D also allowed me to do a bit of a better camera move on it. So the camera is animated fairly normally here, and then when the punch happens, over about 5 frames, it whips to the right and follows the hand into the wall. This really helped to feel the punch a bit more, and it made it a bit more impactful. And then for the wall breaking, it's just literally switching between 2 bits of geo. So in the Object Properties tab, under Visibility, I've keyframed the viewport and render visibility to turn on and off for the 2 objects. So the first one is just a plane, and then as you can see here, it turns off, and it's swapped out by a plane that I cut a hole in for the wall, and then it's revealing the hole underneath. This isn't even a simulation. These chunks are just animated by hand because it's very quick, so they just fall out. And then the inside of the hole, I just added a couple of wires to make it feel like there was some stuff going on in there. And I put a shape key on the button so that it feels like it gets crushed. So you can see here I've got a damaged shape key that I can turn on and off. And I've animated that just so that it deforms the shape of the button once it gets hit. There's very little comp work on this. The Blender render looks like this. And then I just used Cryptomats to change a bit of the skin tones and just lifting this plaster texture on the wall ever so slightly. So this is the full shot. It's pretty cool. I was really happy with this shot. Again, this is one of the ones where the skin texture needed to hold up a lot closer to camera. So up-resing the textures to 4K and doing the Voronoi texture on the skin and also the hair really helps to make it feel a lot more detailed, and actually works this close to camera. And finally, let's talk about the mirror, because this one was quite complicated. It's pretty much the same as all the other ones, except for it also has the additional challenge of seeing the Hulk in the mirror. This is the background footage. I put some tape on the wall and did a 3D track, and then modeled some really basic geometry for the lift, or the elevator if you're American. There's lots more render layers going on in this because it's a more complicated shot. So to start off with, we have the layer of the Hulk. Then there's a shadow pass, which is basically just on the wall. That's the main place you see it. Then I rendered a reflection, which looks like this. There's no real way in Blender to actually render reflections properly in the same way you would like a shadow catcher, where you just get them on their own. So I used my comp brain and I thought, well, how can I render this and then make a way of isolating them? And I also had the same problem for the shadows, because you can't render a shadow catcher in a reflection. It doesn't work. So for the actual reflection, I made a plane at the back here, which is basically just a mirror. It has a shader on it that looks like this. The metallic is turned right up and the roughness is turned pretty low, so it just gives a mirror effect. There's some area lights in the ceiling which are matching the ones that are in the top of the lift. The actual Hulk layer is in this layer, but it's set as indirect only, so we don't see it in the foreground, but we do see it in the reflection, which is what I needed. And then I put just a grey plane on the floor, which is really important for the shadow pass, which I'll show in compositing. And then to isolate the reflections, I didn't come up with this technique, so shout out to Jacob from Inlight VFX. That guy's a genius, and I got this idea from watching his video all about rendering reflections in Blender. I made a reflection mask layer which is rendered completely separately, and it's done by duplicating the geo of the Hulk and setting it to an emission shader so it's completely white in the reflection. Then if I turn off the HDRI so there's no world lighting, this is what gets rendered out for this pass. So I'm still using that geo for the mirror, but now because I've turned off the HDRI and I've turned off the lights in the ceiling, there's no other lighting other than just seeing the emission texture in the reflection, which is why everything else is completely black. So in total there's 4 layers there. There's the Hulk, there's the Hulk shadow pass on the wall, and then there's the reflection and the reflection mask. Then what you can do in compositing is slap them all together. So this is the original footage. This is the tracking markers removed. This is removing me from the reflection in the mirror. Obviously I shouldn't be there. I just did this by using a rotor paint node in Nuke to paint myself out, just using some clone painting and stuff to stretch in the textures from the wall around me. Isolated it to just the bit that I wanted, and then tracked this into the shot. It's not moving too much anyway. So that's before and after. Then after that, I rendered just one frame of the hole in the wall over here. Obviously it got broken in the previous shot, so it still needs to be there in this one. I just rendered this pretty close up from the previous scene, and then a little bit of grading, corner pinned it into place, and 2D tracked it onto the wall, and put a little bit of a defocus on it. So that goes on there. Then we have the shadow pass, which looks like this. Now, like I said a second ago, you can't actually render a shadow catcher in a reflection because it just treats that reflection as some geo. It doesn't realize it should be reflecting the shadow pass, so you can't get an alpha from that. So what I did, like I said, is I put this flat grey plane on the floor with no shader on it. So this is rendered in the reflection. And then I used a luma keyer in Nuke to key the shadows on the floor. So this is just literally keying the brightness, and then I inverted it, so I'm getting essentially keying the shadows instead of keying the highlights. And I just changed the settings in the keyer until I felt like I had a pretty good grasp of the shadows in the scene. Then with a quick rotor shape, I can isolate it just to the areas that I want. It doesn't matter that we're also picking up the Hulk's feet and legs in this because we're going to put him on top anyway, so you won't see this extra stuff here. I then combined that with the shadow pass that goes on the wall, which is here, and then did the trick that I did in the other ones by using the color correct node to take some contrast out of the plate and make it darker. And as you can see, that now puts the shadows in the lift. Then, still using this reflection render pass, I then used the reflection mask, which looks like this in Nuke. This is the emission shader rendered in a black background with no world lighting or anything. I shuffled this into the alpha, so I now have a perfect alpha to cut out the reflection of the Hulk. And then I take the reflections, I did a little bit of color correcting to them, which looks like this. There's a couple of ramps here just to simulate the shadow as the lift door is closing. And then I copied the alpha into this stream and pre-malted it, which allows me to cut it out. I'm also using a color edge node here. This is a third-party node that's free online, you can download it from Nukepedia, but there's lots of nodes that do a similar thing. It's just doing an edge extension, as you can see. So what it does is it eats into the pixels ever so slightly and then drags the color outwards, so I'm kind of extending the green of the Hulk to go outwards. Without it, if I show what it's doing, I was getting some weird kind of light wrappy stuff coming in from the wall behind the Hulk, so the color edge is just removing those, which does a really good job. Then there's a slight defocus. And then down here, I just have some roto for the seams of the mirror. So there's these two vertical lines and then the thicker one going horizontally. So now the Hulk is quite nicely bedded into the reflections of the mirror. And then after that, simply put the main version of the Hulk on top in the foreground. Again, there's some comp work here to make him bed in better. For this shot, I actually used light groups. So I rendered a light group for the lift lights, which is the ones in the ceiling, one for the HDRI, and then also the glossy direct pass here. And I did a bit of grading to all of these just to make the lighting work a little bit better. And then finally, there's some roto for the lift door, which goes on top of him. And that's how that shot was done. That's the most complicated one of all of them. I was really proud of this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Again, all the project files are in the link below to my Patreon, so if you want to pick them up, they're super cheap and it really helps to support what I do, and there's loads of stuff on there now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.